June 10th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking a bit about the 2022 Michigan governor's election, which is set to take place this November. Gretchen Whitmer, who is the incumbent Democratic governor, first winning election in 2018, is the presumptive nominee for November, and she will be facing a Republican candidate that is still to be decided, and for which the primary has become increasingly tumultuous, and the direction of which is very much so not clear. More recently, on yesterday, the 9th of June, 2022, one of the remaining GOP candidates, Ryan Kelley, was arrested following the filing of a criminal complaint in the United States District Court in the District of Columbia. If we look at the criminal complaint here, you can see the various charges for which Mr. Kelley was charged. That included various violations of 18 U.S. Code, Section 1752, as well as 1361. Stuff about knowingly entering or remaining in any restricted building without lawful authority, disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building or grounds, knowingly engaging in an act of physical violence against a person or property in any restricted building or grounds, and willfully injuring or committing depredation against property of the United States. I don't have the attached statement of facts, but nonetheless, these are some very serious charges against Mr. Kelley, and it certainly does bring into considerable question the fate of his candidacy and whether or not he will be able to continue to be a Republican candidate in that primary, or even whether or not he would be a viable candidate. And, notwithstanding the own Mr. Kelley's own issues when it comes to the Republican primary, there are other candidates that had their own issues. They were among them, not sure if I can find the full list of their names. Here we are. Failed to qualify. There are several of them, 5 of them at least, perhaps the most prominent of them being James Craig, who was the former chief of the Detroit Police Department. Mr. Craig was one of the foremost candidates in this primary up until his candidacy was struck down after Democrats mounted some challenges and a court found that there were fraudulent signatures and that the candidacy of not only Craig but also several other Republicans was fraudulent, and they were subsequently, as you can see, they were removed from their opportunity to compete in the Republican primary, and that's created a considerable amount of room for the remaining candidates to become the Republican nominee for the next governor of Michigan. This is the polling showing here Brandenburg, Brown, Craig, Johnson, and Markey not filing enough valid signatures to appear on that ballot. That was on May 23rd. More recently, 3 of these candidates, Craig, Johnson, and Markey Jr., took their appeals to the Michigan Supreme Court. Those were all denied in these various orders here, this one being for Markey on June 3rd. Similarly, on June 3rd for Craig. And a much more extensive rejection of the appeal by Johnson as well on the 3rd of June, right here. And that has meant, essentially, that officially they are not going to be on the ballot this fall, at least in the Republican primary. James Craig has said that he is interested in a write-in campaign. He's not sure how far that will go, whether or not that will actually happen, or how viable a campaign like that would be. But nonetheless, we can see in the most recent polling from May 26th to the 27th, in terms of who, after all those candidates were disqualified, is the most favored by these Republican voters in the state of Michigan, and it was Ryan Kelley, albeit not by a significant margin. Only 19% of the electorate, and most are undecided, which is fair given that A lot of the candidates were recently disqualified. But now Ryan Kelley, his candidacy now in significant doubt, and it just sort of being a very considerable string of setbacks for the Republican Party of Michigan here in terms of trying to put forward a viable and popular candidate. You could see James Craig here, who I mentioned before was doing very well. He was consistently leading in the polling, but now that is all sort of thrown on its head. If we consider the candidates besides Kelley and the ones that were disqualified, we have the likes of Kevin Rink, Garrett Soldano, and Tudor Dixon. It is, not entirely clear which one of these will come to the front and will potentially win the primary in the coming months. But we have a very significant name issue here. How many Michigan Republican voters know who Tudor Dixon is, who Kevin Rink is, who Garrett Soldano is? These were not the primary candidates that were running in this primary. They were candidates that most people don't know and still don't know. The main candidates that people did know, people that ran for governor in 2018, people that were the chief of the Detroit Police Department, captain of the Michigan State Police, they are all eliminated. And now Ryan D. Kelley, perhaps better known for being arrested for his involvement in the storming of the Capitol, rather than his candidacy for the governor of Michigan. We can see that in this narrowed down primary, Tudor Dixon has recently received an endorsement from the DeVos family. If you know Betsy DeVos, the former Secretary of Education during the Trump administration, the DeVos family powerful in the state of Michigan and putting their weight behind Dixon's candidacy, but nonetheless perhaps the most important endorsement, that of Donald Trump. Donald Trump not sure who he wants to endorse, and candidly that is probably a very fair position. It's been a very tumultuous race. There's not been a lot of stability in the race, and it's really not sure which of these other candidates that had sort of been an afterthought will now come to the forefront. Have they been properly vetted? Have they been properly looked at? What is their history? What are they bringing to this campaign season? Not entirely sure. And it, if anything, really does put Governor Gretchen Whitmer in a great position to win re-election this fall, despite the national environment decidedly not being in Democrats' favor on the congressional ballot. Republicans are ahead by several percentage points, which is a very significant difference from 2018. Gretchen Whitmer that year, she ran ahead by almost 10 percentage points in the state of Michigan. And mind you, that being a state that Donald Trump had won in 2016, albeit as well by a very small margin. But nonetheless, that was a significant change there in 2018. Now 2022 expected to be more favorable for the Republicans. But Gretchen Whitmer is in a pretty good place. And if we look at the opinion polling for Ms. Whitmer against some of these various candidates, Republican candidates, we can see that really she has done fairly well. She is in many polls capturing more than 50% of the electorate, which is incredibly significant. If we look at some of the hypothetical polling, we might be able to see as well how she was doing against some of these previously viable candidates, especially James Craig, who, as I said before, was leading in the polling for the Republican primary. He was doing fairly well against Gretchen Whitmer in the polling. You could see them neck and neck with one another. In some polls, he was leading Gretchen Whitmer, and in others, just sort of right on one another, even in terms of a generic Republican. Which would be, your generic, viable, decently well-known Republican. Gretchen Whitmer doesn't do too well. She's faced a lot of criticism for her handling of the pandemic. She took a very forceful stance against the virus in 2020, and the national environment is certainly not favoring Democrats, and so when you put her up against a generic Republican, this is what you get. But you can see that when it comes to the various candidates that are currently available in the Republican primary, the likes of Tudor Dixon, Ralph Rabant, Kevin Rink, and Garrett Soldano, Ms. Whitmer is leading them by double digits. It's not entirely clear yet whether or not these Republican candidates will be able to overcome that significant difference. Will they be able to get a significant amount of fundraising between now and November to really, shore up this significant deficit? Will they potentially receive an endorsement from Donald Trump that might improve their electoral outcome this November? Will they be able to, captivate this national environment that is much more favorable to the Republicans than it is for the Democrats? Right now, it does not appear as though that is the case. You can see here Ryan Kelley, candidacy in doubt. We're not sure where that's going to go. But nonetheless, the situation looking decent for Governor Whitmer. You can see some polling agencies, some prediction agencies, they have this as a lean D seat. These are fairly old, not all of them, some of them. Unclear how that's going to change in light of the Kelley revelations and also the fact that you saw a lot of these different Republican candidates disqualified from the primary. But the presumptive nominee, Gretchen Whitmer, looking pretty well here in her re-election bid this fall. We shall see what happens by the time the August 2nd primary comes. Which candidate do the Republicans coalesce around, if any? And how do those candidates navigate issues with regard to name recognition, fundraising, etc.? Thank you.